who go visit sick children that you don't hear about than there are that you do hear about. I didn't include politicians because I don't know if that's true as much or not. Which type of person do you respect more? God's looking for people who are truly committed to him, not for the way people think that person is committed to God. Are actions alone good enough, or is the heart behind the action, is the motivation important? In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus begins by talking about motivation, talking about the heart, a heart that desires above all else to please and to highlight goodness before God. A heart that wants to be right with God. A heart that wants to please God. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and really all of Matthew chapter 6, Jesus admonishes us to live righteously for an audience of one. If you're someone who takes notes and would like a title, the title of today's sermon is An Audience of One. Let's look at Matthew chapter 6. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. You're seeing me from a screen, so this is my left. This is my right. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what's done in secret, will reward you. Are you a generous person? If so, does your generosity please God? Did you know that there's some forms of generosity that actually do not please God? In Jesus' day, there were religious people who were very generous. The Pharisees, if you look at Luke chapter 18, verses 11 through 12, or Luke chapter 11 and verse 42, the Pharisees would give 10% to God. Do you give 10% to God? The Pharisees would even tithe on the smallest of seeds, it says in Luke chapter 11, verse 42. But in these two cases, it didn't please God. They were generous, but God was not happy with their giving. Right. In the Sermon on the Mount, speaking about patriots of the kingdom of God, Jesus teaches those who would be his followers to have a righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees. That's what we learned in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. He contrasted the righteousness of the kingdom with what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing. And then he contrasted his expectations of his disciples with what the scribes and the Pharisees practiced. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, we're going to look at how we should practice righteousness. As a matter of fact, in this whole the next few sermons, we're going to be talking about the inner patriot. Who are you? Most importantly today, is your righteousness done for an audience of one? Is your righteousness done for an audience of one? In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, it said there, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. You know, if you looked at Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, in some other versions, let's say you're a King James person or a New King James person. Nothing wrong with either one of those. But they translate the word righteousness to alms, or that alms, that's the King James version, or charitable deeds in the New King James version, which would make all of Matthew 6 verses 1 through 4 specifically about charity and giving to the poor. But some of the older manuscripts that we use when are translated for the NIV or the English Standard Version or even the New American Standard Bible, they have the word righteousness here in chapter 6. That's probably a more accurate word. Now, there's nothing wrong with, if you looked at the whole passage about giving to the poor, nothing wrong with that. But the context changes Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, if you look at the entire chapter. Because Jesus goes on to talk about, hey, how do you fast? Hey, how do you pray? What are the things that you worry about? Things that other people are looking at don't necessarily match what's going on in your heart. And so I believe this is rightly translated as righteousness. Every verse in Matthew chapter 6 is not just about giving to the needy, not just about charity, but it's about your personal righteousness, your motivation. So what does Matthew 6:1 say? We're not supposed to do acts of righteousness to be seen by others. And then the first example of that is giving to the needy, and then prayer, and then fasting. Now, it's not that we're supposed to completely avoid being righteous before other people. Remember, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16 says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." What it is saying is you should avoid being righteous specifically to be seen by men, so that people will know how righteous you are by the thing they see you doing. You know, if you leave the lights on in your house all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people are sometimes going to see what's going on in your house because they're going to pass by your house while the lights are on. But they only see what's going on as a consequence of how often your light is on. When people see your good deeds, it's because you should be doing so many good deeds. You should be so righteous all the time, not just when people are looking, but every once in a while, people catch a glimpse. It's always right to do good works, to do good deeds, to be righteous before others, because we are consistently supposed to bring praise to God in our lives. But it's not right to want to do good deeds, to want to be noticed when we're trying to secure praise for ourselves. If we think being at church every Sunday is about people knowing that we're spiritual because we're at church every Sunday, that's a wrong motivation. Right. It can be a right action with a wrong motivation. We got to be careful. There's a principle here in Matthew chapter 6 that Jesus talks about throughout the entire chapter. If in your heart, your main focus, and we have to wrestle with that, is not to glorify God, God will not reward you. If you like to do things and to serve as long as other people are around, if you're that suffering servant who needs to be seen, who needs for everyone to know how hard it was for you to accomplish that one thing that you did for somebody else, man, it was so difficult, then you'll get your reward. People will see how much you suffered. People will hear how much you've suffered. We can't look for our rewards from men as patriots in the kingdom of God. We have an audience of one. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8 taught us that we're supposed to be pure in heart, and we'll see God. Our righteousness has to be trained in on the heart, a heart that performs for an audience of one, an overwhelming desire to bring praise to God, to praise God ourselves for all he's done in our lives, for all he's done he's done in our lives, and that pours out onto our families and our neighbors, our gratitude and our love and our desire to please God. Yeah. It's not meant for our neighbors. It's not meant for our coworkers. It's not meant for our classmates, but they're bystanders of our love and desire to please God, and a little bit gets on them. Jesus then, in talking about giving to the poor, gives an example for patriots of the kingdom that we can really latch our minds around. What should righteousness be like if you are doing it for an audience of one? Verses 2 through 4, Jesus says, so, or because you want to please God, when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they've received their reward in full. This is kind of a what not to do, right? He says, don't be like the hypocrites. And you probably have heard a sermon, maybe you haven't, but where hypocrites is actually, the term there is actually used for actors. People who are pretending to be something, pretending to be someone that they're really not in their hearts. They're putting on a show. This passage here, Jesus says, man, don't be like the hypocrites. Don't announce it with trumpets so you can make sure everyone sees your show. I read a commentary and it talked about how when it was time to give to the poor, there would literally be a trumpet blast. That was a signal when it was time to go and give to the poor. And the Pharisees would draw a crowd because they would make a show of walking down the streets to go and give to the poor. Wow. They wanted to be honored, but they wanted people to know that they were generous, that they were giving. Jesus says of these hypocrites in Matthew 6:2 that they have their reward. They receive exactly, and they receive only what they wanted. Praise from men. Remember verse 1? They have no reward from the Father in heaven, even though they were giving to the poor. They have no reward from their Father in heaven, not now and not in the future, because their hearts weren't for God. And it wasn't really for the poor. It was so that people would know that they loved the poor. So people would know they loved God. They made a show of it. We got to be careful about being patriots in the kingdom, that we're not so much about flying our patriot flag or about telling people how awesome we are as patriots that we forget that we serve a king. All glory should be to the king. Your flag is in your action. Your flag is because your light is on all the time and people know about you. They don't know all about you. They don't see you all the time, but every time they see you, the light is on. The light is on. Our light should shine before the world. There's an important point here in verse 2. So the thought might be, well, maybe we, if we don't have a good heart, or if we don't feel right about it, or if we don't feel convicted about it, or if we don't have a cheerful heart, well, maybe we shouldn't give. Maybe we should hold back when we don't have a right heart. That's not what Jesus says either. Jesus says in verse 2, when you give to the needy. He doesn't say if you give to the needy. It's a good thing to do, but guard your heart. Giving to God, giving to the poor is never in question. The question is, can your righteousness surpass the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? Are you giving for an audience of one? Is God God in your finances? You know, I appreciate that we blew out, really, we did a great job with our special missions offering. The thing we have to weigh that with is, did some people give more because they wanted to get more glory from God? Because I don't know what you gave or when you gave it. Or did some people hold back and give less because they didn't feel like they had a cheerful heart, or times were difficult and I couldn't make a sacrifice? Hey, I'm grateful for whatever you gave. What I am saying is, we need to always be guarding and protecting our hearts while we're glorifying and lifting up God in our lives. And that does have an incredible impact. Maybe that's why Jesus started off with that as an example. Before prayer, before fasting, when it came to separating yourself from finances, how big of an issue is that between you and God? Giving, or really, going back to Matthew 6:1, righteousness that pleases God is supposed to look like something else. It doesn't look like a show. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 3, Jesus says, do not let your left hand, maybe I should put up mine. Do not let your left hand, that looks left, right? I don't know. I can't bring my vision around. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. You know, that's an interesting phrase. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Is it something about being so secretive? The meaning at that time, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, was actually a reference to close friends, to people who are your closest allies. And we still refer to someone as being our right-hand man, don't we? Or our right-hand woman. In fact, if you look at the scriptures of Matthew 20, where did James and John want to be? One wanted to be at Jesus' right, and one wanted to be at Jesus' left. We want to be the closest to you. Jesus isn't saying that we shouldn't keep track of what we give to turn into the IRS, or we shouldn't include any of that stuff on our taxes. It should be like, oh, we should just forget about it. He's not saying that, hey, we shouldn't give via tidely, we should be giving in cash. So he's not saying that how you give is the most important thing. What he's saying is that you should give and then don't think about it so much. It shouldn't be that close to you. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. It shouldn't be something that you're always thinking about, that you're overly reflecting on, or that you're overly rejoicing on. Our giving is between us and God. If we rejoice, it's because of our relationship with God, because we're allowed to have, as it says in 1 Corinthians 8, the joy of this grace of giving. We shouldn't call attention to our giving. Instead, we should be satisfied with having no one know what you give but God. I'm glad that I have no idea what anyone here gives to God. I'm glad that I have no idea how much anyone here gave to special missions. So if I make a comment like that, it's because I know tendencies. This is kind of what happens. If we all gave to God and our righteousness outshined the Pharisees, there's no telling where we could be or what we could do. Yeah. But maybe that's not a time for now, because I don't know what your situation is. That's the great thing about faith. Each of us is called to have it in our situation and to glorify God. We need to be satisfied with having no one know how you live but God. But we shouldn't let that satisfaction be limited by meager faith. Our relationship with God that reflects in things like generosity, like prayer, and like fasting should come from great faith that surpasses what's going on with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, that surpasses it's not about the amount, but surpasses the heart of what they were doing. It's not about giving simply that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. But he's talking about our righteousness, our rightness with God, our rightness for God. We should not only be satisfied with having no one know what you give but God, but we should also be satisfied with having no one know how you live but God. Right. How you live for God should be so much more radical than anyone in your life knows about. Your quiet time should be so much more amazing than anybody else knows about. Your prayer life should be so much more intent and so much more intense than anyone else knows about. That's what this passage is saying. It's not about your giving. It's not about your money. It's about your heart and your righteousness. My dad passed away recently in August, and it was just interesting to go through some things in the house that my mom and dad lived in, and I had an uncle who lived there most of my life, and it was my Uncle Edward, and I was in my Uncle Edward's room, and we were cleaning some stuff out there, and in my Uncle Edward's room, I found an unopened box of Adidas cologne. Whoever wore Adidas cologne in the 90s? Come on, who wore it? Nobody wore Adidas. Bunch of Drakkar fans. All right. Anyway, I found this Adidas cologne in my Uncle Edward's room, and I thought, oh, some cologne. I could do with smelling good a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. But I guess maybe it was October. I decided, you know what? I'm gonna take this cologne. First of all, because it was free, right? I'm gonna take this cologne, and every night before I go to bed, I'm gonna spray on some cologne. I just want Shyla to think that I smell good. I want her to think that, I love her and that I care about, because I do love her and I do care how, but I don't need anyone else to know that I'm smelling good with some Adidas cologne except for my wife, because I just want to please her. I just want to make her happy. That's the way our lives should be with God. We have things of value, things that are special. And we should take these things and offer them to God because we love him so much and we just want to please him. And that's not your money. That's your heart. What you do with your finances, what you do with your time, what you do with your prayer life, what you do with your fasting, those are reflections of your heart for God. It doesn't matter if it's evangelism, serving a brother and sister, giving to the poor. There should be examples of all of those things. Your evangelism, your service to others, your giving, that there should be no one at all who knows about it. No one. There should be specific things you can bring to mind in your life that you did out of a conviction of loving and worshiping and putting God above anything else that no one knows about. There's some things in me and Shyla's life as a married couple that we've done that we've never shared with anyone, that we don't want anyone to know about. We need more of those secret things in our lives, secret worships of God in our lives, secrets that will only be rewarded by God. Only by God. We have to up our game before God so that it will shine before men. If you don't have secret righteousness that you've done that no one knows about, then you don't have nearly enough righteousness that others do know about. Because it's about our heart. It's about what we do when no one's looking. It's just us and God. How important is that relationship to you? Those rewards that can only be answered by God. And by the way, that's okay. So if you're giving to God, so we give as a church, if in your heart you're giving to God because you so desperately want God to reward you and to please you, that's okay. That's Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6. We don't only believe that he exists, but he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That's okay. I had a situation in a church I was in before where there was a brother who had been a disciple a long time and was out of work, and it ended up being that he was asking the church to pay his rent for 13 months. And part of his rationale, I've given to the church for so many years. Look, I have no problem with the church being generous. But 13 months, either there's got to be a lifestyle change or a life change. So somewhere between 1 and 5 months, something's got to be figured out. But that's not what I'm concerned about. It's the heart. I've given so much to the church that the church owes me. We got to be careful with that. We got to make sure that in our giving's only to God. That way, if the church messes up, it doesn't mess up your faith. You know men are going to mess up somewhere. You know you're going to be disappointed by men. Even men and women in the church, you're going to be disappointed by. But if your heart's right with God, you'll never be disappointed. If you're giving your life for an audience of one, you'll never be disappointed. Because your Father who sees what you do in secret will reward you. So righteousness or so generous so often that it becomes second nature. It becomes a habit. That's what it should be in our lives. Our righteousness, our generosity, our kindnesses, our love for others should be such a habit of God-pleasing behavior will be praised by men, but it's not there to be people-pleasing. It's there to be God-pleasing. A habit of man-pleasing behavior will be forgotten by God. I don't know if you are familiar with the hymn Rock of Ages. Rock of Ages. It was written by a guy named Augustus Toplady. And Augustus Toplady said this. He said, "The true Christian cares not how much men hear of his public charities, nor how little they hear of his private ones." We only care about an audience of one before God. Matthew 6:4, your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, your reward may be experienced to some degree in this life, but on the day of judgment, that's what we've got to look forward to. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad." Our habits should be for good. Our habits should be for an audience of one. Patriots of the kingdom have been called to a pure heart before an audience of one. We've been called to hunger and to thirst for righteousness, for rightness with God, but we must ensure that our acts of righteousness are not just Sunday, Wednesday, sometimes Monday night Zoom fellowship acts, but in secret. We're connecting with brothers and sisters that no one knows about. We're serving brothers and sisters in ways that no one knows about. We're being neighborly to our neighbors in ways that we never talk about with anyone, and they don't even know about. If those are our habits, then we're on the right track. We have to ensure that when we act in righteousness, it's all the time.
Right.
Yeah, then our light will be seen by some, but it'll be seen by different people at different times and bring glory to God. We perform our acts for an audience of one. In our generosity, as Jesus speaks of here in Matthew 6:2-4, that has to be done with a desire for praise from God, not praise from others. And not even so we can feel good about ourselves, but so that we can feel good about ourselves before God.
Mm-hmm.
Does our righteousness consistently exceed that of the teachers of the law and the Pharisees in Jesus' day? It's not simply a question of either quantity or quality of our righteousness. We should be talking to ourselves about both. Brothers and sisters, I pray the Lord keeps us free from living as hypocrites,
Right.
that we live as true patriots, not people who wear the gear and who look the part, but who have the heart. May we live for the glory and honor for the audience of only one.